Okay, welcome back. So there are a number of different kinds of molds that can be out there. We are most concerned about a couple of different varieties of molds, and we're going to talk about that. But let's just take some of them off the table right up front. You've seen molds on cheese, for example. Maybe you get a pizza that's been in the fridge too long, or maybe it's been underneath the fridge too long and it starts to get furry. Yes, that is a mold, but no, it is not the kind of mold that you, the realtor, and I, the home inspector, are looking for. Those particular kinds of molds, and by the way, there's a billion different mold kinds. There's not just a variety of mold, there's a number of them. But there's a few that are of greatest interest and risk to those of us who have to breathe every day. So we're going to talk about those. So you got molds on cheese, mold on food. Those happen, but they're not necessarily what we're looking for. In addition, we should probably differentiate between for example, a mold and a mildew and a moss. For example, you see maybe a house with moss on the edge of the shingles if you got a shake roof. And there may be molds up there, but that green stuff that's growing, if the shake roof is old and in poor condition, that stuff is more likely to be moss than mold, and it's on the outside. But we'll talk about that in a later segment as well. So the kinds of molds that we're most interested in are the kinds that grow on wood. Something, either wood or something that perhaps used to be wood. So for example, you can have molds on firewood itself. You can have it on the studs inside the wall. You can actually have molds grow on the paper of the sheetrock. In many cases, I've seen where maybe somebody has a wet crawl space or a wet basement, and that crawl space or basement gets wet for whatever reason, and you get molds start growing there. These are the kinds of molds that we're going to be most concerned about. Another thing I should make clear is that molds are everywhere. Quite often you hear where somebody says they want a mold-free home, and what should be clear is that there is no place on earth, except for perhaps one of those clean rooms where they're making computer chips, where your environment is going to be completely mold-free. So in that sort of an environment, you might possibly get a mold-free environment, but if you're living on pretty much anywhere else in planet Earth, you're going to have some mold spores come and go every time you open the door or a window, because there's mold out there and there's going to be mold inside the house as a result. If you've got dry lumber, for example, that's not going to be a problem because we've got a dry environment. As soon as that wood gets wet and stays wet for a while, now you can start getting molds on there. One of my best stories is that you and I countless times have seen and then ignored a home that is being built, and maybe it's winter, maybe it gets snowed on while this home is in the frame stage, where all you have is just 2x4s and perhaps this wood subfloor, and maybe that's just as far as the home has gotten that day. And then it rains or it snows or whatever might have happened, and you've got all these tens or hundreds of gallons of water that is just laying on the floor, and every one of the studs is wet. If that were to happen, obviously in a home that's finished, there would be an insurance claim about all the mold and issues related to that. It doesn't even raise an eyebrow if the home is in the process of being built. The reason for that is the wood has to be wet for long enough that the molds can go ahead and get attached to the wood and then reproduce and build a colony. And if the wood dries out before that happens, which is what's happening when we're building a home, then we don't have the mold colonies that might have otherwise occurred in a finished home. Key point here is that it needs to be wood that is wet, and it needs to be wet long enough for the mold colonies to grow. Examples of where molds can have that sort of moisture inside the house: indoor houseplants. the leaves and the twigs from that houseplant often just fall straight down onto the soil, and that soil gets watered, and that is going to be enough moisture for molds to decay those leaves, etc., back into soil. That's what molds do. It's their job. It's the reason why they're here on planet Earth, and it's perhaps right and proper that they do that. You're going to have, if you've got a house plant, and if it's real, and if you water it, you're going to have some molds by the natural process of growth and decay from that house plant in your home. For most of us, that addition of molds is not going to be enough to cause a health effect. You can also have molds that can grow perhaps in wet carpet. Maybe it's wintertime, you've got a bunch of little kids with wet shoes that are tramping in and out of the house, and every time they do, they stomp off their feet actually on the carpet. Spills and leaks, of course. Let's say that maybe the dishwasher leaks or the disposal leaks. Maybe somebody is dumping a cup full of water into the dishwasher and perhaps half of that water ends up on the floor. That may or may not cause a mold problem, but it's likely to dry out before we do get a mold issue. By contrast, if the dishes are done every day and as a routine, we're going to be spilling water on that floor and not cleaning it up, that would be more than enough to initiate a mold issue. So you got those sorts of things. I also see where disposals, for example, as they're turned on, maybe they leak, maybe there's a crack, maybe the connections are not what they should be, and so you'll have the drip, drip, drip from there, and those can cause a substantial mold colony there underneath the sink. So those are the kind of things that you should notice whether the home inspector is looking for and writing up. In addition, and as I mentioned, every time you open the door or the window, you're going to have some mold spores come into the house, and some mold spores are going to leave the house going outside, going to be an intermix. So this goes back to the concept that you can't have a mold-free house, but you do want to control the amount of mold that is in the house. Next section, we're going to talk about prevention and causes and how to keep the mold level in the home at reasonable levels.